The cry of an infant cut through the howling wind like a blade through fabric, and Zachary Xander reined his horse to an abrupt stop on the snow-covered trail, his heart hammering against his ribs as he strained to hear it again. February of 1884 had brought one of the worst winter storms Wyoming had seen in years, and he had been foolish enough to think he could make it back to Medicine Bow before the worst of it hit. Now, as snowflakes the size of silver dollars swirled around him and the temperature dropped with each passing minute, he heard that sound again, unmistakable and terrifying in its fragility. He dismounted quickly, his boots sinking into snow that reached past his ankles, and led his bay gelding toward the source of the crying. What he found made his blood run cold despite the years he had spent seeing hard things on the frontier. A woman lay in the snow beside an overturned wagon, her dark hair spread around her like a raven's wing, her face pale as death itself. But in her arms, wrapped in what looked like a torn petticoat and a wool shawl, was a newborn baby, still connected by a glistening cord that disappeared beneath her skirts. "Madam," Zachary said, dropping to his knees beside her, snow soaking through his denim pants. "Madam, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, brown as creek water in autumn, and focused on his face with obvious effort. "The baby," she whispered, her lips cracked and bleeding. "Please, the baby." Zachary had delivered foals and calves, had even helped a camp follower give birth once during his brief stint with a cattle drive crew, but this was different. His hands shook as he pulled off his leather gloves and reached for the knife at his belt. The woman watched him with those enormous eyes, and he saw trust there that he was not sure he deserved. "What's your name?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady as he examined the cord, remembering what old Doc Patterson had told him years ago about the importance of waiting until it stopped pulsing. "Josephine," she breathed. "Josephine Brennan. Is the baby breathing?" "Yes, madam, crying strong as a spring calf." He unwrapped the infant carefully, checking with hands that had gentled wild horses and mended fences, but had never felt so clumsy. A girl, pink and wrinkled and furious at the world she had been born into. "You have a daughter." Tears spilled down Josephine's cheeks, cutting tracks through the dirt there. "I have to tell you something," she said, her voice gaining a desperate strength. "In case I don't make it." "You're going to make it," Zachary said firmly, though he was not sure he believed it. She had lost blood. He could see that much, and exposure in this weather could kill a healthy man, let alone a woman who had just given birth alone in a blizzard. "But first, I need to cut this cord and get you both somewhere warm." He waited until the pulsing stopped, said a quick prayer to a god he was not entirely sure he believed in anymore, and made 2 clean cuts, tying off the cord with strips he tore from his own shirt. The baby screamed louder at the indignity, and Josephine made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "Where were you headed?" Zachary asked as he wrapped the baby more securely, and then turned his attention to Josephine, checking for injuries beyond the obvious. "Anywhere," she said. "Away from my husband. He's not the father. He found out and he's coming after me." Zachary's jaw tightened. He had opinions about men who would chase down a woman in her condition, and none of them were charitable. "Well, he'll have to go through me first. Can you sit up?" With his help, she managed it, though she gasped in pain and fresh blood darkened her skirts. Zachary tried not to let his worry show as he gathered her into his arms, baby and all, and carried her to his horse. The overturned wagon was useless, its wheel broken and the horse that had pulled it nowhere to be seen. Whatever supplies she had brought were buried in snow or scattered across the trail. "There's a line shack about 2 miles north," he said, settling her in the saddle and climbing up behind her, holding them both secure against his chest. It's not much, but it has a stove and walls. That's more than we have here. Josephine sagged against him, and he felt the tremors that ran through her body. Shock, blood loss, cold, any of them could kill her before they reached shelter. He urged his horse forward, keeping one arm locked around her waist while the other held the reins, and the gelding responded with the steady determination that had made Zachary pay twice what the animal was worth 3 years ago. The wind screamed around them, and visibility dropped to almost nothing. Zachary navigated by instinct and memory, trusting his horse when he could not trust his own eyes. Josephine drifted in and out of consciousness, her head lolling against his shoulder, and the baby had gone quiet in a way that terrified him more than the crying had. When the dark shape of the line shack finally materialized through the white curtain of snow, Zachary could have wept with relief. He half fell from the saddle, still holding Josephine and her daughter, and kicked the door open with more force than necessary. Inside, it was dark and cold, but it was dry and the wind could not reach them. He laid Josephine on the single bunk that occupied one wall, then fumbled in the darkness for the kerosene lamp he knew hung by the door. His fingers were clumsy with cold, but he managed to get it lit, and warm light flooded the small space. The shack was maybe 12 feet by 12 feet, with a pot-bellied stove, a rough table, 2 chairs, and the bunk. Not much, but it might as well have been the finest hotel in Denver as far as Zachary was concerned. He got a fire going in the stove, feeding it kindling and then larger pieces of wood from the stack in the corner. Someone, probably one of the other ranch hands from the double bar, had stocked it recently. Once heat began to fill the small space, he turned his attention back to Josephine. She was unconscious now, her breathing shallow. The baby lay beside her, and Zachary picked up the tiny girl carefully, checking her over in the lamplight. She seemed healthy enough, though her skin was cooler than he would have liked. He wrapped her in his coat, holding her against his chest as he searched the shack's limited supplies for anything useful. There were cans of beans, coffee, a jar of sugar, some flour, salt pork, and, blessed mercy, a wool blanket folded on a shelf. He wrapped the baby in the blanket, then turned back to Josephine, who needed his attention more urgently. He had never undressed a woman before, not like this, with clinical necessity rather than passion. His face burned as he worked, removing her wet and bloody clothing, trying to assess the damage. She had torn during the birth, he could see that, and she was still bleeding, though not as heavily as before. He packed cloth torn from a relatively clean flour sack against the wounds, then covered her with every blanket and piece of fabric he could find. The baby began to cry again, a thin, hungry sound. Zachary looked from the infant to Josephine and back again, feeling helpless. The child needed to eat, but her mother was in no state to feed her. "Come on," he said, touching Josephine's face gently. "You have to wake up. Your daughter needs you." Her eyelids fluttered but did not open. Zachary tried again, more insistently this time, and finally her eyes focused on him. "The baby," she whispered. "Right here. She's hungry. Can you feed her?" Understanding dawned in Josephine's eyes, followed by embarrassment. Zachary turned his back, busying himself with the coffee pot and trying to give her what privacy he could in the tiny space. Behind him he heard rustling, then the baby's cries cutting off abruptly as she found what she needed. "Thank you," Josephine said softly. "You saved our lives." "Not yet," Zachary replied, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups, "but we're working on it." He brought her the coffee, keeping his eyes carefully on her face. She had managed to arrange the blankets to cover herself, and the baby was a small bundle against her chest. In the lamplight, despite her exhaustion and the hollows beneath her eyes, Josephine was beautiful in a way that made his chest tighten. I'm Zachary Xander, he said, pulling one of the chairs over to sit beside the bunk. I work for the Double Bar Ranch about 10 miles south of Medicine Bow. Thank you, Mr. Xander, she said, wrapping her hands around the coffee cup. They were shaking badly. Zachary is fine, or Zach. Most people call me Zach. He paused, then asked the question that had been burning in his mind. Your husband, is he likely to follow you in this weather? Josephine's face went hard in a way that aged her. He had thought her young when he first found her, maybe 20 or so, but now he revised that estimate. She had to be at least 23 or 24, old enough to have suffered and learned from it. Martin doesn't let weather or sense stop him when he's angry, she said. And he was very angry when I left 3 days ago. 3 days. Zachary could not keep the shock from his voice. You've been on the trail for 3 days in your condition. I knew the baby was coming, but I thought I had more time. I thought I could make it to Laramie, maybe find work, start over. She looked down at her daughter, and her expression softened. I didn't expect her to come during a blizzard on the worst trail in Wyoming. How far along were you when you left? The midwife in Cheyenne said I had 2 weeks, maybe 3, but babies come when they want to come. She sipped the coffee, and some color returned to her face. Martin's not the father is dead. Killed in a mine accident in the South past 6 months ago. His name was Thomas, and he was kind, and we were going to get married. But then the mine collapsed, and Martin offered to marry me instead, and I was stupid enough to think it was mercy. Zachary felt anger kindle in his gut. He knew the type, men who saw a desperate woman as an opportunity rather than a person. He hurt you, not at first. At first he was almost kind. But then he started drinking more, and he would say things about the baby, about how it was not his, about how I was damaged goods he had been charitable enough to take in. Her hands tightened on the cup. 3 days ago, he came home drunk and said he was going to take the baby away after it was born. Said he would give it to his sister in Casper to raise because I was not fit to be a mother. So I waited until he passed out, took what I could carry, hitched up the wagon, and left. Good, Zachary said flatly. A man like that doesn't deserve to be called a husband. Josephine looked at him with surprise, as if she had expected judgment rather than support. Most people would say I should have stayed, that I made vows. Most people are fools. Zachary stood and went to check on the fire, adding more wood. You did what you had to do to protect yourself and your child. That takes more courage than staying ever would. Silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the howling wind outside. The baby had fallen asleep, her tiny face relaxed and peaceful. Josephine watched her with such fierce love that Zachary had to look away, feeling like he was intruding on something sacred. What will you do? He asked finally. When the storm breaks, I don't know, keep going, I suppose. Find work somewhere. I can sew and I can cook, and I'm stronger than I look. But her voice lacked conviction, and they both knew the truth. A woman alone with a newborn would struggle to find anyone willing to hire her, especially a woman fleeing a husband. Zachary made a decision that he knew would change his life, made it without hesitation or doubt. You could stay in Medicine Bow. The town's small, but it's growing. The railroad came through 2 years ago, and we're getting more respectable every month. There's a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Chen, and she's always looking for help. I don't have money for boarding, Josephine said quietly. I do. When she started to protest, Zachary held up a hand. Consider it payment for saving my immortal soul. I was on my way to Medicine Bow to drink myself stupid and pick a fight with whoever looked at me wrong. Finding you gave me something better to do with my time and money. Why were you going to do that? The question caught him off guard. He had not talked about it with anyone, had kept it locked tight in his chest where it could not hurt anyone but himself. But something about Josephine, about the way she looked at him with those grave brown eyes, made him want to answer honestly. "Because 5 years ago today, my brother died, and I didn't save him," Zachary said, the words coming rough and painful. "We were working a cattle drive, and there was a stampede. He got thrown from his horse and went down right in the path of 200 head of cattle. I tried to reach him, but I wasn't fast enough. By the time the herd passed, there was nothing left to save." Josephine's free hand reached out and found his, squeezing gently. "I'm sorry. So every year on this day, I get drunk and pick fights and generally make an ass of myself, because if I don't, I have to sit with the memory, and that's worse." He looked down at their joined hands, her small and fine boned against his calloused palm. "But tonight I get to sit with something else. I get to remember that I saved 2 lives instead of thinking about the one I lost." "You did save us," Josephine said softly. "I don't think I ever really thanked you properly. If you hadn't come along when you did, we would both be dead right now." "Then we're even. You saved me too." The baby stirred and whimpered, and Josephine shifted her carefully, wincing. Zachary saw pain flash across her face and frowned. "How bad is it?" he asked, nodding toward the blankets. "I've felt better," she admitted, "but I've felt worse too. When Martin would come home angry." Zachary's hands clenched into fists before he could stop them. "If I ever meet this Martin of yours, he and I are going to have words." "If you meet him, you should run," Josephine said, but there was a ghost of a smile on her lips. "He's twice your size and mean as a snake. I've handled mean snakes before." Zachary stood and went to the supplies again, searching for anything that might help with infection or pain. There was a bottle of whiskey, probably left by whatever ranch hand had stocked the place, and he brought it back to the bunk. "This is going to hurt, but it'll help keep infection away." Josephine's face went pale, but she nodded. "Do what you need to do." He gave her a leather strap to bite down on, then worked as quickly and gently as he could, cleaning the wounds with whiskey-soaked cloth while she shook and tears streamed down her face. When it was done, he felt like he had run 10 miles, and Josephine looked like she might pass out again. "You're doing good," he said, smoothing her hair back from her forehead. "You're so strong, Josephine." "Josie," she whispered. "Thomas used to call me Josie." "Josie then." He liked the way it felt in his mouth, soft and sweet. She fell asleep soon after, exhausted beyond endurance, and Zachary kept watch through the night. The storm raged outside, shaking the small shack and piling snow against the walls, but inside they were warm and dry. He held the baby when she cried, walking her back and forth in the small space, humming the few lullabies he remembered his own mother singing before she died when he was 7. The infant was so small, so impossibly fragile, and yet she had survived being born in a blizzard on the open trail. She had her mother's fighting spirit, that much was clear. As he looked down at her tiny face, her eyes squeezed shut and her mouth working even in sleep, Zachary felt something shift in his chest. Protectiveness, fierce and absolute. Dawn came gray and cold, and the storm showed no sign of letting up. Zachary made coffee and beans, the smell filling the shack and waking Josie. She struggled to sit up, gasping in pain, and he was there immediately to help her. "Easy," he said. "Don't push yourself." "I need to feed her," Josie said, reaching for the baby. Zachary handed over the infant and turned his back again, giving them privacy. He heard Josie talking softly to her daughter, though he could not make out the words. When he turned back around, she was smiling, really smiling, and it transformed her face. "She's perfect," Josie said. "I know every mother says that, but she really is. What are you going to name her?" "I thought about naming her after my mother, but my mother never did anything particularly worth remembering. Thomas, though, Thomas was good and kind, and he would have loved her so much. She looked up at Zachary. You think it's strange to name a girl after her father? I think it's right, Zachary said. What about Thomasine? Josie's face lit up. Thomasine, Tommy for short. Yes, that's perfect. They spent 3 days in the line shack while the storm exhausted itself, and Josie recovered enough strength to travel. Zachary went out twice a day to see to his horse, fighting through drifts that reached his chest, making sure the gelding had water and what feed he could scrounge. The rest of the time, he stayed inside with Josie and Tommy, and something grew between them in that small space, something that felt inevitable and right. He learned that she was 24, that she had been born in Ohio and come west with her father after her mother died. Her father had passed 2 years ago from cholera, leaving her alone in Cheyenne with no family and few prospects. She had worked as a seamstress, and that was how she met Thomas, who had brought in a shirt to be mended. He was shy, she said, smiling at the memory. It took him 4 visits before he worked up the nerve to ask if he could walk me home from the shop, and then another 3 before he kissed me. We had 6 months together before he died. 6 perfect months. Zachary told her about growing up on a farm in Missouri, about losing his parents young and raising his younger brother Samuel on his own, about coming west after Sam died, because he could not stand to stay in a place full of memories, about the years he had spent drifting from ranch to ranch, never putting down roots, never letting himself care too much about anything. That sounds lonely, Josie said. It was, Zachary admitted. It is, but lonely is safe, can't lose what you don't have. Can't gain anything either, Josie pointed out gently. On the 3rd day, the storm finally broke. Zachary woke to silence, and when he opened the door, he saw clear blue sky and sunshine so bright on the snow that it hurt to look at. The world had been transformed into something clean and white and new. We can leave today, he said, turning back to Josie. If you feel strong enough. She was nursing Tommy, and she looked up at him with an expression he could not quite read. And then what? Then I take you to Medicine Bow, get you set up with Mrs. Chen, and we figure out the rest as we go. Zachary. She said his full name, and he heard the emotion in it. Why are you doing this? You don't owe me anything. You already saved our lives. He crossed the small space and knelt beside the bunk, taking her hand. Maybe I'm doing it because for the first time in 5 years, I woke up and didn't wish I was dead. Maybe I'm doing it because when I look at you and Tommy, I see something worth protecting. Or maybe I'm doing it because I'm falling in love with you, and I know it's too soon and too fast and I have no right to feel this way, but there it is. Josie's eyes filled with tears. It's too soon, she whispered. I know. Thomas has only been gone 6 months. I know. I just had a baby 3 days ago. I know. And I'm still legally married to Martin, even if it was a mistake. I know all of it, Zachary said. And I'm not asking you to love me back. I'm not asking you for anything except the chance to help you and Tommy get on your feet. Whatever happens after that, whatever you feel or don't feel, that's your choice and I'll respect it. Josie reached out and touched his face, her fingers trembling against his beard. You're a good man, Zachary Xander. I'm trying to be, he said. They left the line shack at midday. Zachary on horseback with Josie in front of him, and Tommy bundled against her chest. The journey to Medicine Bow took longer than it should have, because he took it slow, mindful of Josie's pain and Tommy's fragility. But finally, as the sun was setting, they rode into town. Medicine Bow was small, maybe 300 people at most, but it had a main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, a schoolhouse, and the boarding house Zachary had mentioned. He rode straight to the latter, a tidy 2-story building painted white with green shutters. Mrs. Chen came out when she heard the horse, a small Chinese woman with iron-gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She took one look at Josie and Tommy, and her face softened. "You bring me strays now, Zachary Xander," she said, but there was no bite to the words. "I brought you a good woman who needs a safe place to stay and a chance to rest," Zachary replied. "Her name is Josephine Brennan, and she's got skills you can use." Mrs. Chen came closer, peering up at Josie. "You run from something." "Yes, madam," Josie said quietly. "Good. I like women with sense." Mrs. Chen reached up to help Josie down. "Come inside. You look half dead and that baby needs a proper bed." Zachary dismounted and followed them inside, carrying what few supplies they had. Mrs. Chen led them upstairs to a small room with a bed, a dresser, and a rocking chair. Simple but clean and warm. "You stay here tonight," Mrs. Chen said to Josie. "Tomorrow we talk about work and payment. Tonight you rest." She looked at Zachary. "You stay too. I don't like the look in your eye." "You think something bad is coming?" "Martin Brennan might come looking for his wife," Zachary said. "Then Martin Brennan will find more than he bargained for," Mrs. Chen said grimly. "I did not leave my home and cross an ocean to let bullies hurt women under my roof. Go downstairs." "I bring you food." She left, and Zachary helped Josie sit on the bed. Tommy was sleeping, her tiny face peaceful. "She's formidable," Josie said. "She survived the transcontinental railroad construction and opened a business in a town that didn't want Chinese," Zachary replied. "Formidable doesn't begin to cover it." They ate the dinner Mrs. Chen brought up, stew thick with vegetables and bread still warm from the oven. Real food, not beans from a can, and Josie ate like she was starving. Afterward, Zachary stood to leave, but Josie caught his hand. "Stay," she said. "Please. I don't want to be alone tonight." So he stayed, sitting in the rocking chair while she slept in the bed with Tommy beside her in a dresser drawer padded with blankets. Every hour or so, Tommy would wake and cry, and Josie would feed her, and Zachary would watch them in the lamplight and feel his heart expand in ways he had not known were possible. He must have dozed off near dawn, because he woke to find Mrs. Chen standing over him with a cup of coffee and an expression that was half amusement, half approval. "You got it bad," she said quietly. "Yes, madam," Zachary agreed, accepting the coffee. "She know," I told her. "Good. Honesty is important, Mrs. Chen glanced at the bed where Josie and Tommy still slept. "Her husband will come, maybe, probably. Then we prepare, I have friends, we watch for strangers asking questions." She paused. "You staying close as she'll let me," Zachary said. The next week passed in a blur. Zachary went back to the double bar and explained the situation to his boss, a gruff man named Carter who had a soft spot for underdogs and a hatred of men who mistreated women. Carter not only gave Zachary time off, but also spread the word among the ranch hands to keep an eye out for Martin Brennan. Zachary spent his days in Medicine Bow, helping Mrs. Chen with odd jobs around the boarding house and spending time with Josie and Tommy. He watched Josie grow stronger day by day, saw color return to her cheeks and steadiness to her hands. She was amazing with Tommy, patient and loving even when exhausted, and Zachary found himself imagining a future he had never dared to hope for. But Josie was careful with him, friendly but distant in a way that hurt even though he understood it. She was grieving Thomas, recovering from childbirth, and terrified that Martin would find them. Romance was the last thing she needed, no matter what Zachary felt. Then, 10 days after they arrived in Medicine Bow, Martin came. Zachary was in the boarding house kitchen helping Mrs. Chen carry in firewood when one of the ranch hands burst through the door. "Big man asking questions at the saloon," he said breathlessly. "Says he's looking for his wife, describes Josie to a fault." Zachary's blood turned to ice. "Where is he now?" "Still at the saloon." But he's got a gun and he's mean drunk. Zachary looked at Mrs. Chen. Get Josie and Tommy somewhere safe. The church, maybe. Reverend Walsh will help. Where you going? Mrs. Chen demanded. To have those words I promised Martin, Zachary said grimly. He strapped on his gun belt, checked that the revolver was loaded, and walked out into the cold February afternoon. Main Street was quiet, most people having heard there was trouble brewing and wisely deciding to stay inside. Zachary walked to the saloon with steady steps, his heart pounding but his hands calm. Martin Brennan was exactly what Zachary had expected, huge, mean-faced, and radiating violence. He stood at the bar with a whiskey bottle in one hand and hatred in his eyes. You Brennan? Zachary asked from the doorway. The big man turned, swaying slightly. Who's asking? The man who found your wife bleeding out in a snowstorm and saved her life, Zachary said. The man who's telling you to get on your horse and ride out of Medicine Bow and never come back. Martin's face darkened. Where is she? Where's Josephine? Somewhere you'll never find her. She's under protection now. She's my wife. She belongs to me. She's a free woman who made a choice to leave a man who mistreated her, Zachary corrected, and she's not going back. Martin slammed the bottle down and took a step forward, his hand dropping to his gun. You got no right to keep a man from his wife. And you got no right to chase down a woman who wants nothing to do with you. Zachary's voice was cold. Draw if you're going to draw, Brennan. Otherwise, get out of my town. For a long moment they stared at each other, the tension so thick Zachary could taste it. Then Martin's hand moved, fast for a drunk man but not fast enough. Zachary's gun cleared leather first, and the shot echoed in the saloon like thunder. Martin staggered back, looking down at the blood spreading across his shoulder. You shot me, he said, sounding surprised. I sure did, Zachary agreed, his gun still trained on the big man. And if you ever come back here, if you ever even think about Josie or her daughter again, the next bullet goes between your eyes. Are we clear? Martin's face twisted with rage and pain, but he was smart enough to recognize when he was beaten. He stumbled out of the saloon, and Zachary followed, watching as the man mounted his horse and rode out of town, leaving a trail of blood drops in the snow. By the time Zachary made it to the church, his hands were shaking with reaction. He found Josie in the front pew with Tommy, Mrs. Chen standing guard beside them like a small, fierce dragon. Is he gone? Josie asked, her face white. He's gone, Zachary confirmed, and he won't be back. She burst into tears and he went to her, pulling her into his arms while being careful of the baby between them. She sobbed against his chest, great heaving sobs that shook her whole body, and he held her and murmured soothing nonsense and wished he could kill Martin Brennan all over again for what he had put her through. When the tears finally subsided, Josie pulled back and looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. You could have been killed, but I wasn't. You shot him for me. I'd have done worse, Zachary said honestly, and I'd do it again. Josie touched his face, and this time when she looked at him, something had changed. The distance was gone, replaced by warmth and wonder and the beginning of something that made Zachary's heart soar. I was so scared, she whispered. Not just for me, but for you. When that man said Martin was asking questions, all I could think was that I couldn't lose you. I couldn't lose someone else I loved. Zachary's breath caught. Josie, I know it's too soon. I know Thomas has only been gone 6 months and Tommy is barely 2 weeks old and this is all moving so fast. But when I thought you might die, I realized something. Love doesn't run on a schedule. It comes when it comes, and what I feel for you is real, even if it shouldn't be yet. It can be as real as you want it to be, Zachary said, his voice rough with emotion. I'm not going anywhere, Josie. Whatever you need, however much time you need, I'll be right here. She pulled him down and kissed him, soft and sweet and full of promise. Tommy made a noise of protest at being squished between them, and they broke apart, laughing. "Come on," Mrs. Chen said from where she had been tactfully examining a hymnal. "Let's go home. You two make this church indecent." They walked back to the boarding house together, and that night, Zachary stayed again. And the night after that. And the one after that. Slowly, carefully, they built something new from the broken pieces of their pasts. 2 months after Zachary found Josie in the snowstorm, she filed for divorce from Martin Brennan on grounds of abandonment and cruelty. The judge in Rawlins was sympathetic, especially when he heard about Martin chasing her down and Zachary having to shoot him, and the divorce was granted quickly. 6 months after that, on a warm August day in 1884, Zachary Xander married Josephine Brennan in the Medicine Bow Church. Tommy was there, nearly 8 months old and already showing signs of her mother's stubbornness and her father's kind eyes. Mrs. Chen stood up as Josie's matron of honor, and Carter from the double bar was Zachary's best man. They bought a small house on the edge of town, nothing fancy but theirs, with a garden for Josie and a barn for Zachary's horses. Josie took in sewing, as she had always intended, and between that and Zachary's wages from the ranch, they made a decent living. Tommy grew like a weed, walking at 10 months and talking in full sentences by 18 months. She called Zachary Papa, and the first time she did it, he cried like a baby himself. 2 years after their wedding, Josie gave birth to a son. They named him Samuel, after Zachary's brother, and he had his father's dark hair and his mother's brown eyes. 3 years after that came twin girls, Rebecca and Ruth, who were holy terrors from the moment they could crawl. The years passed in a blur of happiness that Zachary had never imagined possible. He watched his children grow, watched Josie bloom into a successful businesswoman whose sewing skills became famous throughout the territory. They had hard times, certainly. Winters were brutal, summers could be worse, and there were years when the ranch struggled and money was tight. But they had each other, and that made everything bearable. Tommy grew into a beautiful young woman who inherited her mother's strength and her biological father's gentleness, with a healthy dose of Zachary's stubbornness thrown in. She married a banker's son from Laramie when she was 22, and Zachary walked her down the aisle with tears in his eyes, remembering the tiny infant he had held in a lined shack during a blizzard. Samuel followed in his father's footsteps, working as a ranch hand and eventually becoming a foreman. He married a school teacher named Clara and gave Zachary and Josie 4 grandchildren who ran wild through the house that had once seemed so spacious and now felt wonderfully full. The twins remained unmarried well into their 20s, much to Mrs. Chen's despair. Rebecca became a teacher, and Ruth shocked everyone by becoming a deputy sheriff, one of the first women to hold such a position in Wyoming. Zachary could not have been prouder. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Zachary took Josie back to the line shack where they had spent those first 3 days together. It had fallen into disrepair, the roof sagging and the walls weathered, but it was still standing. "Hard to believe it's been 20 years, Josie said, looking around the small space that had once held their entire world. "Best 20 years of my life," Zachary said, pulling her close. "Even the hard parts, especially the hard parts, because we faced them together." Josie turned in his arms and kissed him, and they were 19 and 44 and every age in between, young lovers and old marrieds and everything that mattered. "I love you," she said against his lips. "I love you too," he replied. "From the moment I heard Tommy cry in that snowstorm, I loved you both." They stood there in the ruins of the line shack, holding each other as the sun set over the Wyoming landscape, and Zachary thought about the strange path that had brought them to this moment. A brother's death, a storm, a woman in desperate need, a baby born in the worst possible circumstances. Any one of those things could have gone differently, and he would never have found this life, this love, this family. But it had all happened exactly as it needed to, and he was grateful for every second of it. 25 years after he found Josie in the snowstorm, Zachary woke one morning to find her still asleep beside him, her hair now more gray than brown but still beautiful in the early light. Tommy was long married with children of her own. Samuel ran his own ranch now. The twins were successful in their respective careers. The house was quiet in a way it had not been for decades. "Morning," Josie mumbled, opening her eyes. "Morning, beautiful," Zachary replied, kissing her forehead. "You're a terrible liar," she said, but she was smiling. "I'm an old woman." "You're my woman," he corrected, "and you'll always be beautiful to me." They had breakfast together, just the two of them, and talked about their plans for the day. Tommy and her family were coming for dinner. Samuel had said he might stop by with the grandchildren. Life continued, full and rich and wonderful. That afternoon they sat on the porch of their house, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Zachary held Josie's hand, their fingers intertwined, and thought about all the years they had shared. "Do you ever think about that night?" Josie asked quietly. "When you found me?" "Every day," Zachary admitted. "It was the night my life began, even if I didn't know it yet." "Mine too," Josie said. "I was so scared and so sure I was going to die, and then you appeared like an answer to a prayer I didn't even know I was saying." "I'm glad I was there," Zachary said. "I'm glad I got to cut that cord and hold Tommy and be the one to bring you both to safety. Because everything good in my life came from that moment." Josie leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence as the sun continued its descent. Inside the house, they could hear the sounds of their family arriving, children's laughter and adult voices mixing in a joyful cacophony. "We did good," Josie said. "We did real good," Zachary agreed. They stood and went inside to greet their family, their children and grandchildren filling the house with noise and life and love. Dinner was chaotic and wonderful, with too many people crammed around the table and not enough chairs and everyone talking over each other. After the meal, Tommy pulled out a guitar and started playing, and someone started singing, and soon everyone joined in. Zachary sat back and watched, his arm around Josie, and felt a contentment so deep it almost hurt. This was what he had been saving her for, all those years ago. Not just her life, but this life, this family, this future full of joy and love and second chances. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet again, Zachary and Josie lay in bed together. She curled against him, her head on his chest, and he stroked her hair absently. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what? For saving me, for loving me, for giving me all of this." "I should be thanking you," Zachary replied. "You saved me just as much as I saved you that night. Then we're even." "We're even," he agreed. They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, and Zachary dreamed of snow and wind and a baby's cry cutting through the darkness. But this time, when he reached the woman in the snow, she was not dying. She was smiling, and when he helped her up, she took his hand and they walked together into a future bright with promise. The years continued to roll by, each one bringing its own joys and sorrows. They lost Mrs. Chen to old age when she was 93, a fierce woman until the very end. They celebrated as grandchildren became adults and great-grandchildren were born. They weathered the changes that came to Medicine Bow as the 20th century approached, the town growing and modernizing in ways both wonderful and strange. Through it all, Zachary and Josie remained devoted to each other, their love as strong in their 70s as it had been when they first married. They still held hands when they walked down Main Street. They still kissed goodbye every morning and hello every evening. They still looked at each other with wonder sometimes, amazed that they had found each other in the vastness of the frontier. When Zachary was 78 and Josie was 77, they took one last trip out to the old line shack. It had finally collapsed completely, just a pile of weathered boards in a clearing, but they could still see where it had stood. "This is where it all began," Josie said, standing in the ruins. "This is where we began," Zachary corrected. They stood there for a long time, remembering. Then they walked back to their horse and buggy, moving slowly but together, and rode home to Medicine Bow. 5 years later, on a cold February morning exactly 63 years after Zachary had found Josie in the snowstorm, he passed away peacefully in his sleep. He was 83 years old, and he died with Josie's hand in his, and all 4 of his children around his bed. At the funeral, the church was packed. Tommy spoke, now an elderly woman herself but still strong, and told the story of how her father had cut her umbilical cord in a blizzard and saved both her and her mother's lives. "He was the best man I ever knew," she said, tears streaming down her face. "And he taught me that family is not always about blood. It's about who shows up when you need them most. It's about who stays." Josie lived for another 3 years after Zachary died. She spent that time surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a matriarch beloved and respected. But everyone could see that part of her had gone with Zachary, and when she finally passed in her sleep at the age of 80, there was a sense that she had simply decided it was time to rejoin the man she loved. They buried her next to Zachary in the Medicine Bow Cemetery, under a cottonwood tree that had been a sapling when they first came to town. The headstone was simple. Josephine Xander, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother, she was brave when it mattered most. At the funeral, Ruth, now a gray-haired woman in her 50s, told her own children about the grandmother who had fled an abusive husband with nothing but courage and determination, and the grandfather who had found her in a snowstorm and loved her for the rest of his life. "They taught us that love is a choice you make every day," Ruth said. "They taught us that family is built, not born. And they taught us that sometimes the worst moments of your life lead to the best things that ever happened to you." The family gathered afterward at the house that Zachary and Josie had built together, now owned by Samuel, but still full of memories. They told stories and laughed and cried, and Tommy brought out the old blanket that Zachary had wrapped her in that first night in the line shack, now threadbare but carefully preserved. "This is where it started," she said, holding the blanket gently. "A cowboy, a woman in distress, and a snowstorm. It sounds like something from a dime novel, but it was real. It was our family's beginning." Her children and grandchildren gathered around to see the blanket, to touch this tangible piece of history. And in that moment, the love that Zachary and Josie had built together lived on, passed down through generations, a legacy more valuable than gold or land or any material wealth. Because in the end, that was what mattered. Not the hardships they had endured or the obstacles they had overcome, but the love they had created and the family they had built. A love that started with a cry in a snowstorm and a cowboy brave enough to answer it, and lasted far beyond the grave. Years later, when Medicine Bow celebrated its 150th anniversary, the Historical Society put up a plaque commemorating the town's notable residents. Among the names were Zachary Xander and Josephine Xander, with a brief description of how they had met during the terrible blizzard of 1884. Tommy's great-granddaughter, also named Josephine, stood in front of the plaque with her own daughter, and told the story that had been passed down through 5 generations. The story of a woman who gave birth in a snowstorm on the open trail, and the cowboy who found her and cut the cord himself, and how that single act of courage and compassion had created a family tree that now numbered in the dozens. "He saved her life that night," young Josephine said. "But she saved his too. That's what they always said. They saved each other." And in the cold February wind that blew through Medicine Bow, carrying with it the promise of spring and new beginnings, it almost felt like Zachary and Josie were there, watching over the family they had created, their love still burning bright after all these years. The end.